Inside Canada's Parliament, the atmosphere was electric. Questions flew across the chamber, but only one issue mattered: the future of the Brampton auto workers.
3,000 auto workers in Brampton learned that the Prime Minister had sold them out and failed them in negotiations with the United States of America. $15 billion, tax dollars, to the company that is moving their jobs south. So, surely the government would have negotiated a jobs guarantee for every single Canadian Stellantis employee. Will they release that guarantee and the entire contract so Canadians know where their dollars went?
Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre demanded answers after Stellantis announced its plan to move production from Ontario to Illinois, taking roughly 3,000 jobs south of the border. The debate was more than a political skirmish. It became a reflection of a country struggling to protect its industrial identity in a turbulent North American economy.
Mr. Speaker, of course, what Stellantis announced for the Brampton plant last week was completely unacceptable. And Stellantis has made solemn commitments to this government and to their workers, and they need to honor their commitment. An hour ago, I met here in Ottawa with the head of Canadian Stellantis, with the head of Unifor, and also with the Minister of Economic Development of Ontario. We're one strong team, Canada, and we will make sure that these jobs stay in Brampton.
While Poilievre accused the government of wasting 15 billion Canadian dollars in subsidies, Mélanie Joly stood her ground. She emphasized that Ottawa, Ontario, and the unions were united as Team Canada. Behind her calm tone was a message that resonated beyond politics. This was about defending Canada's sovereignty in the face of American economic pressure. She reminded Parliament that Stellantis had received millions in public support to retool the Brampton plant, money that came from Canadian taxpayers. The company had made clear promises to invest and build new models there. Now, with production shifting to Illinois, Joly vowed to hold Stellantis accountable under its legal and financial commitments. Her focus was not on partisan blame, but on ensuring that Canadian workers were protected. By the end of the debate, the lines were drawn. The Conservatives framed the crisis as a government failure. The Carney administration framed it as a national fight against unfair U.S. tariffs. That confrontation in Ottawa was only the surface of a much larger story, one that began long before the parliamentary shouting started.
For decades, Brampton's auto plant symbolized Canada's industrial strength. Generations of workers built vehicles there for Chrysler, Fiat, and later Stellantis. It wasn't just an assembly line, it was a source of identity, community, and middle-class stability. So when the announcement came in October 2025 that Stellantis would relocate Jeep Compass production to Illinois, it hit like a national earthquake. Across Ontario, the news spread through factory floors, union halls, and local diners. For many, it was more than the loss of 3,000 jobs. It was the erosion of something deeply Canadian, the belief that the nation could compete with the United States in manufacturing excellence. Newspapers and talk shows called it a betrayal of Canadian industry. What had seemed like a corporate decision quickly turned into a political turning point. Canada's industrial pride had been tested, and its leaders were under pressure to prove that the nation could stand on its own against the weight of Trump's economic power.
Stellantis' decision was not made in isolation. It reflected the growing pressure on global automakers caught between Trump's tariff walls and the economics of North American supply chains. The company's $13 billion U.S. investment was announced as a reshoring win, adding 5,000 jobs in Illinois. The White House celebrated it as proof that tariffs worked. Yet economists quickly pointed out a contradiction. By punishing Canada, the United States' closest trading partner, Washington disrupted the very network that made North American manufacturing competitive. The integrated auto industry depended on cross-border parts and logistics refined through decades of cooperation under the 1994 NAFTA and its successor, the USMCA. Trump's tariffs didn't just pressure foreign competitors, they fractured that network. Canadian-made engines, batteries, and electronics that once flowed easily across the border now faced delays, higher costs, and legal disputes over domestic content. The short-term result looked like a win for Trump: more jobs on U.S. soil and a symbolic political victory heading into the 2026 USMCA review. But the long-term reality was far more uncertain. Supply chains became costlier, U.S. automakers faced retaliation from trading partners, and Canada, rather than retreating, began to transform its industrial strategy. What was meant to weaken Ottawa's leverage had the opposite effect. Canada started pushing for deeper cooperation with Mexico, expanding electric vehicle partnerships in Quebec and British Columbia, and exploring European and Asian markets to diversify exports. Trump's tariffs had triggered the very independence they were designed to suppress.
At the heart of this crisis lies something larger than trade numbers. The auto industry represents a century of Canadian industrial pride. In 2009, when Chrysler, now Stellantis, was collapsing, Ottawa stepped in with rescue funding to keep the company alive. Canadian taxpayers kept those assembly lines running. 16 years later, the same company's withdrawal felt like history in reverse. For Prime Minister Mark Carney's government, the issue was no longer just about Stellantis. It was about national credibility. If foreign corporations could take public money, break commitments, and shift jobs south under U.S. pressure, what did that mean for Canada's sovereignty? In response, Ottawa launched a coordinated plan. The federal and Ontario governments began reviewing investment contracts to ensure stronger job retention clauses. Financial support for automakers was now tied to long-term employment guarantees. Unifor, the national auto union, secured talks to extend worker benefits until 2027. The message was clear: Canada would not fund corporations that abandoned Canadian workers. Meanwhile, Joly and her team intensified diplomacy in Washington, pressing for exemptions to the 25% auto tariff and for recognition of Canada's role in North America's electric vehicle supply chain. Behind closed doors, officials argued that integrated production was not a threat, but a strength for the entire continent. This moment marked a turning point. Trump's pressure campaign had forced Canada to think differently, to see industrial policy not as dependency on American demand, but as a foundation of economic sovereignty. The government's response, though defensive at first, began to evolve into something more assertive: a vision of a self-sustaining Canadian manufacturing base capable of standing beside the United States, not beneath it.
In the months after the Stellantis announcement, both nations drew lessons from the fallout. The U.S. celebrated the Illinois jobs as proof that America First was working. But industry data told a different story. The Canadian Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association found that supply chain disruptions and duplicated costs had raised vehicle prices in North America by nearly 8% since the tariff wave began in 2025. In Canada, the shock turned into resolve. Investment in electric vehicle battery plants surged, with Ontario and Quebec attracting around $12 billion in new commitments by late 2025. Instead of retreating, Canadian policymakers adapted, using the crisis to rebuild industrial strength. Trump had aimed to dominate North American manufacturing through tariffs and pressure. What emerged instead was a more determined neighbor that refused to be defined by Washington's agenda. Mélanie Joly's message now echoes nationwide. Canada's leaders and workers were shaken but united. Sovereignty is not granted by trade deals, it is earned through persistence. As the U.S. prepares for new trade talks in 2026, it faces a Canada that is stronger and unwilling to play second in the North American hierarchy. Trump's policy brought a short-term win, but it also sparked a long-term awakening. Canada's industrial pride was tested, yet it endures. From Parliament to Brampton's silent assembly lines, one conviction now defines the nation. The fight for Canadian industry is not over, and this time, Canada intends to win.
US President Donald Trump has again escalated trade tensions, announcing new tariffs that directly targeted home furnishing giants like IKEA. From October 1st, the US will impose 50% duties on kitchen cabinets, bathroom vanities, and related products, and 30% tariffs on upholstered furniture.
Across the United States, a quiet panic has spread through the furniture industry. Warehouse floors that once buzzed with movement are slowing down. Retailers are cutting orders, and suppliers are fielding calls from anxious customers. What began as a post on the president's social media has turned into a wave of uncertainty for an entire sector of the economy. For decades, the U.S. furniture market has relied on global supply chains. Nearly 90% of wooden furniture sold in American homes is imported, and half of those imports come from Vietnam and China. These are not just numbers, they describe how the industry breathes. From timber yards in Southeast Asia to showrooms in North Carolina, everything depends on cross-border flows of materials and labor. Now, a sudden shift in tariff policy has put that entire structure under pressure. Under the new order, imported lumber faces a 10% tariff, while kitchen cabinets, vanities, and other finished furniture are hit with 25% duties. Those rates could climb to 50% by early 2026 if trade talks fail. The intention is to protect American workers and revive domestic manufacturing. But inside the factories and stores, many are wondering if this cure is worse than the disease. When prices rise and shipments slow, families feel it first. Sofas, tables, and cabinets are not luxury goods anymore. They are part of daily life. And when the government taxes those essentials, the pain moves quickly from ports and warehouses to every living room in the country.
Whatever the new furniture tariff would be, it would just be instead of that 20% rather than on top of it. And again, wrapping up within 50 days, that means these could be in place as soon as October 11th.
The announcement of a 10 to 25% tariff shook the market instantly. Within hours, shares of major furniture retailers fell on Wall Street. The fear was simple. If the cost of imported materials rises overnight, every stage of the business, design, logistics, assembly, and sales will feel the squeeze. Industry groups say that most American furniture companies are not ready to produce at scale inside the country. 3 decades of outsourcing hollowed out domestic capacity. Factories closed because production abroad was cheaper and faster. Today, that dependence has become a weakness. Executives describe a sense of paralysis. Orders have slowed. Distribution centers are holding back shipments, waiting to see how high the tariffs will climb. Retailers face a dilemma: raise prices and lose customers, or absorb the cost and lose profit. Even small manufacturers that use local materials feel the pressure. They rely on imported parts and coatings, now tied to the same tariff regime. The result is a system-wide chain reaction. Instead of sparking a renaissance of American furniture making, the new policy has shaken what remains of it. Rebuilding an industry cannot begin with fear. The deeper issue lies in how furniture is made and moved. For decades, the United States exported raw logs to Asia, where factories turned them into finished products before shipping them back to American retailers. That pattern kept costs low and supply steady. The tariff decision disrupts that rhythm. Imported furniture now faces higher costs, but the U.S. lacks enough processing and manufacturing capacity to fill the gap. Many companies do not own the equipment or trained workforce needed to rebuild what they once outsourced. What looks like a patriotic move on paper turns into a logistical nightmare in practice. Lumber producers cannot sell efficiently to foreign partners, while domestic processors struggle to secure labor and environmental permits. Some plants face months of delay just to expand or install new coating systems. Shipping costs and raw material prices are rising. Importers report longer lead times and higher freight bills. The industry, built on thin margins, has little room to absorb shocks. Workers feel it directly. Smaller shops are cutting hours. In parts of the Midwest and Appalachia, employment in furniture production had only just begun to recover. That fragile progress is now at risk again. The policy meant to close the gap with foreign producers is instead widening the divide between the cost of making and the cost of living. North of the border, the effects are just as complex. Canada, the largest supplier of softwood lumber to the U.S., now faces the same 10 to 25% border tax applied to timber and furniture shipments. The move adds strain to one of North America's most integrated trade relationships. For Canadian mills, these tariffs mean reduced access to the American market and fewer jobs in provinces like British Columbia and Ontario. But Canada is adapting. With American buyers paying more for materials, Canadian producers are looking elsewhere. Some are investing in domestic furniture production and building new export links with Europe and Asia. Others are courting U.S. retailers to move part of their operations north, where costs are lower and regulations more predictable. This shift creates an unintended outcome. In trying to isolate American manufacturing, Washington may have pushed investment into Canada instead. What was once a seamless cross-border supply chain is beginning to fragment. The same piece of wood that once moved freely across the Great Lakes is now trapped between two competing policies, and that tension is quietly reshaping the balance of North American trade. The promise behind the tariff policy was simple: protect American workers, rebuild American factories, and strengthen the economy. But the reality unfolding in the furniture industry tells a different story. Instead of revival, there is disruption. Instead of growth, there is hesitation. Retailers are struggling to keep prices stable. Families are delaying purchases because a dining set now costs hundreds more than it did a few months ago. Local producers are paying more for materials, while their customers are paying more for finished goods. Canada, meanwhile, is turning this moment into a long-term advantage, diversifying production and positioning itself as a stable alternative in a volatile North American market. Back in the United States, the question remains: can tariffs truly rebuild what decades of offshoring have dismantled? Or are they just symbols, gestures that look strong but leave the system weaker? Protection is not recovery. It can shield an industry for a moment, but it cannot replace the investment, coordination, and trust that real growth requires. As the new tariffs take hold, American furniture makers are confronting a difficult truth. The cost of building walls may be higher than the value of what those walls are meant to protect. And in the end, every tax on a table or chair is not just a line on a trade ledger. It is a reminder of how deeply connected economies have become and how easily one political decision can turn a promise of protection into the price of isolation.
Last week, Mark Carney and Donald Trump acted like two old friends in the Oval Office.
I want to be a great man, too.
U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick took a shot at Canada's auto industry. Lutnick spoke at a conference in Toronto where, behind closed doors, he reportedly told the audience that when it comes to the auto sector, it's America first, Canada second.
It began with a threat that was supposed to shake Canada's auto industry. When U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick told an audience in Toronto, the message from Washington was clear: move production south or face the consequences. In Ontario, the reaction was instant. Premier Doug Ford called it a massive threat and said such a statement could only come with the president's approval. For many Canadians, it was the moment the trade tension turned personal. But what came next was not surrender. It was strategy. Instead of reacting with anger, Ottawa chose precision. Behind the scenes, Prime Minister Mark Carney's government began reinforcing the very system Washington was trying to undermine. The U.S. may have wanted to pull the strings of North American manufacturing, but its own tariffs were starting to choke the same supply chain American automakers depend on. The result was an irony that no one in the Oval Office could ignore. The harder Washington pushed, the more Canada adapted and rebuilt.
To understand why this threat backfired, it helps to look at how deep the two economies are tied together. A car built in Ontario typically contains more than 50% of its parts sourced from the United States, according to figures from the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association. The U.S., in turn, sells more finished vehicles to Canada than to any other country in the world. Every model that rolls off an assembly line in Michigan or Ohio is part of a network that stretches across the Great Lakes. Ontario alone employs about 500,000 workers in auto production and parts manufacturing. Global brands like Volkswagen and Stellantis are building large-scale battery plants there, linking Canada's critical minerals to the future of electric mobility. These factories are not isolated outposts, they are extensions of a shared industrial base that has taken more than half a century to form. This is why tariffs hit both sides. A report released this summer by the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association showed that U.S. automakers are projected to pay $188 billion in additional tariff costs between 2025 and 2028. Those are taxes paid by American companies on American imports, parts that, ironically, come from their own suppliers in Canada. The administration expected new jobs to flood back home. Instead, costs rose, vehicle prices climbed, and the slowdown spread across the very states the policy was meant to protect. By trying to redraw the borders of production, Washington forgot how integrated North America had already become. You can't separate what has been built together for generations without breaking the system itself. While the White House celebrated its tariff push, Ottawa quietly reshaped the rules of its own market. Canada maintained a 25% counter-tariff on U.S.-made vehicles, but offered a remission framework for companies willing to keep their production and employment levels inside Canada. It was a subtle form of pressure: stay and receive support, or leave and lose access to incentives. The federal government also launched a $2 billion Canadian Strategic Response Fund to help manufacturers and workers absorb the shock. The goal was not retaliation for its own sake, but reconstruction, to turn temporary disruption into a path toward long-term independence. At the same time, Ottawa and the Ontario government kept diplomatic channels wide open. Representatives like David Patterson continued direct talks in Washington, meeting governors, senators, and members of Congress every week. They reminded U.S. officials that Canada buys more American-made cars than any other market, that cutting ties would mean losing their largest customer. Inside Canada, the focus shifted to building resilience. The government prioritized domestic production of EV batteries, invested in processing of nickel and lithium, and encouraged automakers to source more components locally. By linking the auto sector to critical minerals development, Canada transformed a moment of weakness into an industrial strategy. Major manufacturers responded not by leaving, but by expanding. Volkswagen and Stellantis proceeded with their planned facilities, supported by provincial and federal incentives. Japanese and American automakers reaffirmed that Canada's stable workforce, energy supply, and access to both markets made it a safer long-term base. For Washington, the result was unexpected. The policy designed to bring jobs back to the U.S. had instead strengthened Canada's manufacturing ecosystem. What started as a tariff war became a quiet realignment, one that left Canada more self-reliant than before. The White House's approach was built on leverage, not partnership. By fragmenting the North American trade framework into separate sectoral deals, Washington aimed to gain short-term control, but the cost has been uncertainty. Analysts from the Brookings Institution and Reuters have noted that unpredictable tariff cycles have already discouraged new U.S. investment in manufacturing. Companies cannot plan when trade rules shift every few months. At home, higher import costs on steel, aluminum, and auto parts are squeezing profit margins. The Wharton budget model estimated that persistent tariffs could trim up to 6% of U.S. GDP over the long run while reducing average wages by about 5%. Meanwhile, Canada has used selective countermeasures to shield its industries and retain export access. Brian Kingston of the CVMA warned that the U.S. cannot win a global competition if it fights its closest allies. That warning is proving true.
While the United States struggles with tariff inflation, China is rapidly expanding its electric vehicle output, producing 3 times more capacity than its domestic demand, according to the International Energy Agency. In this race, North America either competes as a bloc or falls behind as rivals flood global markets. Trump's attempt to isolate Canada has had the opposite effect. It exposed how deeply dependent U.S. automakers are on cross-border trade, how vulnerable they are to cost surges, and how little control tariffs actually bring. Each new tax designed to protect American jobs is instead cutting into American profit and pricing U.S. consumers out of the market. What began as a show of strength has turned into a study in unintended consequences. The tariffs meant to punish Canada have forced it to innovate, invest, and stand more firmly on its own industrial footing. Ottawa did not outshout Washington, it outlasted it. Through methodical policy and quiet diplomacy, Canada turned economic pressure into leverage. The broader lesson reaches beyond North America. In a world of integrated supply chains, power built on disruption rarely lasts. Real strength comes from cooperation, consistency, and credibility. For all the talk of America first, the reality is that the United States cannot thrive without the partners that make its own prosperity possible. And that may be the greatest irony. The harder Washington tried to divide the continent, the clearer it became that North America only succeeds when it moves together.
I'm disappointed that I came to Canada, a Canada that it is very, very difficult to find Canadians who are passionate about the American-Canadian relationship.
The ramifications of a new relationship with the United States are immense. And one thing is clear, we cannot afford to wait this out. Canada needs to do more of that. Canada needs to diversify its trade.
In recent months, Canadians have been told repeatedly that their country is nothing more than a junior partner. The United States ambassador complained that Canada had run an anti-American campaign. Donald Trump and his allies floated the idea of Canada as the 51st state. Tariffs on steel, aluminum, autos, and farm products were designed to squeeze Ottawa until it gave in. Yet the outcome is not what Washington expected. Instead of fear, these attacks have triggered a surge of national resolve. Canada is not bending, it is changing, and in that change, it is becoming more independent than at any point in modern history. Trump's tariff play was meant to show dominance. A 25% duty on Canadian metals and restrictions on autos and farm exports threatened thousands of jobs. But the Bank of Canada made it clear that waiting for the storm to pass was not an option. Governor Tiff Macklem told business leaders in Saskatoon that Canada must diversify, remove trade barriers inside its own borders, and open more markets overseas. The message was blunt: prosperity cannot rest on dependence. Ordinary Canadians have responded in ways that statistics make plain. According to Statistics Canada, the number of residents returning from the U.S. by car in August fell 34% compared to the same month last year, marking the 8th straight monthly decline. Air travel to the U.S. also dropped by 25% year over year. Sales of Canadian-authored books at Indigo, the country's largest bookseller, rose 25%. These are not small cultural shifts. They show a population adjusting its choices in direct reaction to American pressure. At the same time, Prime Minister Mark Carney introduced the One Canadian Economy Act to eliminate internal trade barriers and fast-track national projects. What was supposed to weaken Canada has instead sped up reforms that strengthen it. Washington thought talk of annexation would remind Canadians of their dependence. Instead, it had the opposite effect. The 51st state remark, repeated often enough by U.S. officials, reinforced the idea that Canada's identity was under threat. Consumers and politicians alike pushed harder to assert independence. Provinces most exposed to American tariffs, such as Ontario with its auto industry and Quebec with aluminum and softwood, saw public support for Buy Canadian campaigns intensify. The move by Ontario's premier to protest a Crown Royal bottling shift to the U.S. showed how symbolic gestures captured the national mood.
Meanwhile, in Saskatchewan and Alberta, where oil and agriculture were spared from heavy tariffs, the tone was different but the conclusion similar. People wanted their province's products to reach global markets without relying on American approval. Each insult and each tariff, far from intimidating Canadians, built a stronger consensus that the country must stand on its own.
Step back, and the pattern is unmistakable. Trump's tariffs were supposed to force concessions. Instead, they fueled consumer nationalism, unified federal and provincial strategies, and reduced the centrality of U.S. trade. Exports to the U.S. fell about 2% this year, according to Statistics Canada, but exports to other countries rose. That is diversification in action, pushed by necessity. Canada is also investing in infrastructure to move goods east and west more efficiently, so dependence on the southern border is no longer the only option. Trump wanted to corner Canada, to remind it of its smaller size and geographic limits. What he created instead was momentum for independence. Canadians are buying differently, traveling differently, and thinking differently about their place in the world. Every tariff and every slight has backfired, turning a strategy of pressure into a project of nation-building. In trying to make Canada the 51st state, Trump may have become the unexpected architect of a more independent Canadian nation.